You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the political editor of the Daily Mirror, John Stevens, and economics editor at the Spectator, Kate Andrews. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, The Guardian claims Jeremy Hunt has been told the budget on Wednesday risks condemning Britain to a lost decade for living standards, leaving working families £1,900 a year worse off. The budget is also the lead for The Times, which says the Chancellor is drafting plans for up to £9 billion of tax rises and spending reductions to pay for a possible 2p cut in national insurance. The Mirror says all public services are in crisis amid fears Jeremy Hunt is plotting a budget tax giveaway. The Metro says a highly addictive drug prescribed for anxiety has been linked to the fastest rising death toll of any medication in Britain. The Mail claims care home residents are being looked after by unqualified migrants as Home Office loopholes to obtain visas are exploited. The FT reports OPEC members, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, have extended cuts to oil production for another 3 months in an attempt to boost prices that have remained subdued despite rising geopolitical tensions. And The Star leads with a man who has retained his world record title after eating 34,000 Big Macs. We're not wanting to dispute that fact. It does seem like an awful lot. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by the political editor of the Daily Mirror, John Stevens, and economics editor at the Spectator, Kate Andrews. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the Daily Mirror. Budget on Wednesday. The Mirror is giving a budget cuts warning, saying schools in crisis, hospitals in crisis, armed forces in crisis, as are councils, police, prisons, courts and even hospices. That's the price of the Tory tax bribes, as they are calling them. Kate.
So one of the big questions in the autumn statement last year when Jeremy Hunt started the tax cut spree was, what do you have to do to find that money? And one thing that we discovered from the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is trying to calculate those numbers, is at the time with what was announced last autumn, that you would be looking at about £20 billion worth of real terms cuts in the next Parliament in order to pay for the tax cuts. That's for what's already been announced so far to encourage business investment, to cut national insurance for employees. The big question on Wednesday is how much more would need to be cut to deliver another round of tax cuts. Jeremy Hunt has been playing down expectations over the past few weeks. He was hinting in January that we hadn't seen anything yet. The tax cuts were really coming now. He has completely rolled that narrative back. But we know there's going to be something. And I suppose the Mirror's point here is, if that does include more spending cuts, where are they coming from? And are they realistic? Do we really think in the next Parliament you're going to see £20 billion plus worth of spending cuts from a Tory government or a Labour government?
John.
Yeah, I think the Tories have got themselves into a really tricky situation here. As Kate says, Jeremy Hunt for months has been saying tax cuts are coming on their way. We've had Rishi Sunak saying that as well. And now we've got closer to Wednesday. It doesn't seem like there is going to be the cash there to offer substantial tax cuts. And so it looks like they're going to find the money to do it somehow. And it's been suggested that one of the ways they could do that is by cutting public services. And I think that politically, that could be a big mistake for them. You look at all the polling and people say, yes, tax cuts are great, but they also say they want investment in hospitals, they want investments in schools. And you've got the great list here of all the different crises in public services, whether that's schools, hospitals, councils. And as much as people want tax cuts, they also want, if they're ill, to be able to go to hospital, not to have to wait ages on a waiting list. They want to send their kids to a school where there's not the risk of the ceiling collapsing because of dodgy concrete. And I think there is a real risk here that if they do cut services and the opposition can say we're going back to austerity, that those tax cuts could be counterproductive, and it's not possibly where the public is at the moment.
Kate, do you think that the Chancellor is playing down the prospect of tax cuts in order to give a much wanted surprise on Wednesday?
There probably will be some kind of surprise. We used to see those from Chancellor Rishi Sunak back in the day. He's, of course, Prime Minister now, and I think still has a similar flair to his style, which he has passed on to Jeremy Hunt. They will want to pull a rabbit out of a hat. But I think what we saw this morning from the Chancellor was quite impressive, really. I mean, you could tell that there was no pep in his step. He was having to tell the public over and over again in the media round this morning that he's going to be prudent and responsible with the public finances. Frankly, it sounded like something that we used to hear when he and Rishi Sunak were first on Downing Street together, right after the Liz Truss mini-budget fiasco, when they were saying to the public, give us a bit of time to sort out the public finances, then you'll get your tax cuts. I think the difficulty is that it's been over a year, really, since that happened. It's been 18 months that they've been in there. If they're still not able to deliver the tax cuts, I agree with John that, you know, for parts of the public, tax cuts won't be the priority. But for the Tory government and their base, it really is. And what they're able to deliver on Wednesday, if it's disappointing, especially to the grassroots of the Tory party, that's going to be an additional headache for the government.
It is likely to be disappointing, isn't it, John? Because we know that at the beginning of the year, the figure was about 30 billion for the fiscal headroom, which in reality now is around half of that, well, 13 billion. So a big disappointment is coming down the track.
Possibly. I think there is an element of expectation management that, I mean, we've talked about how for months they've talked about tax cuts are coming, and now they've realised you do need to get expectations in a sensible place. So maybe they do have some big offer on Wednesday. But you look at what happened. We had the autumn statement only in November where they took 2 percentage points off national insurance. Did that change the polls? No, it didn't at all. You look at the polls, and for the last 6 months, consistently, Labour has had a 20-point lead on the Tories. Taking 2 percentage points off national insurance didn't have an impact on the polls. And for some reason, you speak to Tory MPs and they're saying, well, if we just cut taxes, it will be fine and we may be able to cut the lead that Labour's got. And they've done it. They tried it. It didn't work. So why they think, let's scrape together some money, let's cut public services, let's offer another 2p off national insurance or maybe income tax. I'm just not convinced that's going to be the thing that solves the Tory election problems.
Kate, he's suggesting that he will pursue further that cut to national insurance, isn't he?
It seems to be the case. The Financial Times, which we have up here, points out that to cut national insurance further, every p that you cut costs about £5 billion. To cut income tax, every p costs £7 billion. So it is cheaper for the Treasury to continue the path to cutting national insurance. And the narrative set out in the autumn statement is we want to make work pay better. We consider this to be a pro-growth initiative. It would make sense to continue the NI cuts, but again, to John's point, the expectation for the past few months is that we'd see some meaningful, substantial income tax cuts. I think something else interesting on the front page of the Times is they point out where Jeremy Hunt's going to try to increase stealth taxes in order to pay for perhaps an income, but much more likely a national insurance tax cut, looking at removing tax breaks for second homeowners who let out their properties, looking at Labour's plan to change non-domicile tax status. One of the things I'm going to be looking for on Wednesday, which I think is really important, is what's happening to the overall tax burden. Because you can't say you're cutting taxes if the tax burden is still rising to a post-war high. And in the autumn statement, despite meaningful tax cuts for business and workers, the tax burden stayed exactly the same. And what's interesting on the front page of the Times is if he's going to be raising taxes elsewhere to cut taxes in another place, giving with one hand, taking with the other, are the Tories going to get the tax burden down? And can the Tories realistically go into a general election with the tax burden going to a post-war high, which they are bringing to that post-war high? What a tricky spot for the Tory party to be in, not least because it's been insisting that it's going to be different from the Labour Party on fiscal policy.
And certainly you could see the woes of the world on Jeremy Hunt's shoulders as he was interviewed today.
I think he was having a tough time.
Yeah, and also the late negotiations? Because, as we understand, they're still sort of crossing the T's and dotting the I's in Downing Street tonight, which seems incredibly late, doesn't it?
It also feels like Rishi Sunak is very involved in this budget, and part of that, there were stories around last weekend suggesting that there was some tension between Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. But in the pictures released by Downing Street and the Treasury at the end of the week, it was Jeremy Hunt sat there at the desk with Rishi Sunak on his shoulder, pretending he's still Chancellor.
John and Kate, thank you very much for the moment. Coming up, much more from the newspapers, including this story in the Metro. Their headline, Gaza ceasefire talks recede over fate of Israeli hostages. We'll be right back with that and other stories. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, the political editor of the Daily Mirror, John Stevens, and the economics editor at the Spectator, Kate Andrews. Let's have a look at the Metro to start with in this section. And this story about the ceasefire in Gaza, the negotiations perhaps not proceeding as was hoped, and rumours that the Israeli delegation will not be taking part in Cairo. I believe they aren't even present at the moment, Kate.
Yes, so this was an attempt by the US and the Qataris to broker some kind of ceasefire. The expectation was that it would be for around 6 weeks so that Israel could try to get more of the hostages back. It would be a temporary truce deal, but a longer one than we've seen previously. Hamas delegates arrived to have these conversations. Israeli delegates didn't. Now, Israel is saying that they didn't arrive because they want a full list from Hamas of the hostages that they still believe to be alive. That seems incredibly reasonable to me. Of course, on the other side, you have world leaders, including now Vice President Kamala Harris, calling for an immediate ceasefire as they look at the huge death toll of Palestinians that is only climbing by the day. This just continues to be a tragic incident, a huge loss of human life. Those demands for ceasefire are rising, but Israel is, I think, probably quite likely to stand firm on what it wants to see and who they think is coming home before they come to the table for such conversations.
And John, the calls for an immediate ceasefire from the Vice President Kamala Harris, that certainly indicates a change in tone, doesn't it? I mean, that's the strongest call that we've had to date.
Yeah, we've seen the US gradually change their tone in the last few months, strengthening it, being much firmer with Benjamin Netanyahu. But as Kate says, in this instance here, we do seem to have a problem with the hostages. And we found this back in November when they had that week-long pause in fighting, that there's such uncertainty about how many of the hostages were taken are still alive and who are they being held by. Back in November, there were concerns that many of them weren't actually being held centrally by Hamas. They were being held by all these different militant groups. And so Hamas weren't able to say, well, we can hand over so many people because they didn't know where everyone was. And as Kate says, if there is going to be a proper ceasefire, which I think most people around the world would be keen to see, then Israel is perhaps quite understandable in saying, we want to know exactly which of the hostages are alive and which of them do you think you will be able to hand over?
And Kate, certainly the talks have been hampered by the incident around the relief convoy, which Joe Biden did say would be an issue in going forward in terms of talks and negotiations. Yes,
it's interesting to see how the US position has changed on this. It's also fascinating to see how Qatar has become such an important country in brokering this deal. And, you know, this is what the US used to pride itself on. And the fact that the US and the Qataris are teaming up here and trying to get both sides to the table, I think is a very interesting, in some ways, one might say worrying, but also interesting development in who really holds the power here and who's being listened to. But yes, that increase in escalation from the US, you know, it was weeks ago, really, that I think Joe Biden's commitment to what Israel was doing was incredibly firm. It's not to say that the US's commitment to Israel is shaken, but that narrative for calling for an immediate ceasefire from the vice president is a really meaningful shift in the tone.
And John, certainly the airdrops from America point to the deterioration in the situation, don't they?
Yeah, and you've got that picture there in the metro of these food parcels starting to be dropped by the air. And we know that the awful problems there have been of getting aid into Gaza, that it is such a complicated system because you've got them coming in, there aren't big roads coming in, they have to be security checked, and then they go from one place to get unloaded from trucks and then loaded back into other trucks, that you can just see that there is just such a desperate need for help in Gaza, that anything to get food in there, to get water in there, is obviously desperately needed.
OK, let's turn to a domestic story on the front of the Daily Telegraph and the very shocking stats that the police haven't solved any burglaries in half of the country.
Yeah, this is quite remarkable. This is a Telegraph analysis showing that no burglaries were solved in 48% of neighbourhoods in England and Wales over the past 3 years. This comes after October 22, when you had 43 police chiefs promising, it was a landmark promise, that somebody would attend every break and report. In the year that followed, the number of charges against people who broke into people's homes actually fell down to an abysmal 3.9%. I mean, burglary is such an intimate crime. It is a huge betrayal of your full sense of safety and trust. These numbers are highly alarming. And there's some comments in here from the former victims commissioner about how breaking into one's home now feels like a free-for-all. It's very difficult to look at these figures and feel otherwise, because your chances of getting away with it are incredibly high in 48% of the country.
Yeah, and John, very quickly, anecdotally, people will tell you that when they do call the police, they very rarely attend.
Yeah, that is a problem. And as Kate says, there is such a psychological impact. If you have someone burgle your home, the feeling that someone has been in there, especially if you're someone with children, that is an absolutely horrific thing to happen to you. And you want the police to do everything they can to catch the burglars.
Indeed. John and Kate, thank you so much. We'll